Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We've been in a little bit of a lull as of late in terms of severe weather across the country, but that is going to change over the next few days, starting today, Wednesday, April 19th, and going into the next few days. We have a slight risk out, at least at the moment. I'm doing this right before the SBC, the new day one SBC outlook is coming out. So this is the current day one outlook for today, Wednesday. We'll check back later and see the updated day one outlook here in a little bit. But this is a slight risk, level 2 out of 5 for now, that encompasses parts of central to north central Iowa, down into southeast Nebraska, much of the eastern half of Kansas, down through a sliver of western Oklahoma, with a large marginal risk surrounding that. All hazards on the table for today: 5% tornado threat up there from central Kansas northeastward, damaging winds, and perhaps large to very large hail from southeast Nebraska southward along the dry line into Oklahoma. We're going to focus on today's setup in this video. I do want to take a look at the next couple of days, though. We will touch on that briefly toward the end of the video. For tomorrow, April 20th, Thursday, we have a slight risk from southeast Missouri all the way through Arkansas into the northeastern quadrant of Texas. All hazards on the table for tomorrow: tornadoes, damaging winds, and large hail, perhaps significant hail there in northeast Texas. And then on Friday, April 21st, slight risk all the way down toward the Texas coast there, 15% severe probabilities down by the coast. So once again, going to take a look mostly at today's threat in this video. It's a very nuanced, unique setup, and one that should have some interesting points to talk about. I'm doing this a little bit early today at kind of a weird time because I have a dentist appointment here in just a little bit. So I'm going to try to make this video a little bit on the shorter side, although I always say that and it never happens. So, but let's go ahead and dive right in here. We have our water vapor satellite imagery. You don't see a whole lot going on around the country. We do see a little swirl here in the northern plains. That is part of this larger scale trough that has been entrenched across the western half of the country for the last day or two, and that is going to amplify very slightly, and this will be our main upper support for severe storms across the region today. And if you take a look at our upper air maps here, our 500 millibar map, you see that troughing feature out here across the western half of the country. Closed contour here across southeast Montana. Just really broad, somewhat zonal flow across the plains at the moment. Mostly, west southwest to east southwest to east-northeast flow across the central plains there. Again, this is going to amplify just a little bit, and we should see the effects of this trough start to move in throughout the day today. That will help somewhat in our upper level and synoptic scale support for severe storms with this particular setup. We have had this southwesterly flow across the Rockies for much of the last day or two. And so if we go down to 850 millibars, we'd expect to see some semblance of low-level cyclone here. This is exactly what we've got. Very broad low-level cyclone here out across the central part of the country with an associated low-level jet, 40, 45 knots or so out here from north-central Texas, north and northeastward into Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and up to the north. So broad swath of low-level jet ahead of this cyclone. This cyclone will continue to move out, maybe a couple different centers in here. We should start to see renewed cyclogenesis out to the east of the Rockies as this upper level trough starts to eject into the plains today. We'll take a look at our surface map, and you see a complex surface pattern at this point. We do see a surface low center up here on the North Dakota-Montana border, a little bit of a surface low here just into southeast Nebraska with an associated frontal boundary. You see the wind shift there out across Kansas. This will start to shift. This initial low will shift northeastward throughout the day, bringing that cold front with it, and that cold front will eventually begin to slide southeastward. It'll eventually be draped somewhere like that. It will begin to slide southeastward. Could perhaps act as a warm front initially as that low meanders off to the northeast, but then eventually the cold front will start sagging southeastward into the evening today and tomorrow into Friday. That will be our main player, at least at the surface, for severe storms. But we will start to see the replacement of this current cyclone with a new cyclone here across western Kansas, and this should deepen throughout the day, and this should really start to pull this dry line and this moisture northward east of the dry line into Kansas and Oklahoma. And it looks like they just issued the new outlook. We'll wait a couple of minutes for it to populate on the SPC site and then take a look at that in just a few minutes there. So let's go ahead and look at our surface data. Let me refresh it here. So this is our surface data right here. You see we have pretty nice moisture all the way up into basically southeast Nebraska at this point. Some 60s dew points there along the Kansas-Nebraska border, stretching all the way down here through western Kansas into the Texas Panhandle. Some semblance of dry line setting up here at this point. This will continue to mix eastward a little bit throughout the day and tighten pretty significantly. And there's been quite a bit of model spread over the last few days on this surface pattern, with the NAM definitely being the most robust with this surface pattern, really tightening the dry line ahead of this new surface low here across southwest Kansas. And we get this kind of triple point feature, this moisture tongue feeding into the low, and ahead of that, south of the cold front, ahead of the dry line, right at that apex is where we have been looking at the most robust threat for severe weather, although some of the models are still all over the place with that. We'll show you in just a second. But overall, very nice low-level moisture that will continue to stream northward throughout the day and deepen a little bit. You see a little bit higher dew points here into Texas at this point. Those will stream northward pretty quickly as that surface low strengthens across southwest Kansas this afternoon. All right, let's get into some soundings. Hopefully the SPC site is up yet. Not quite yet, so we will use these soundings from the College of DuPage site. We'll go to our 12Z map, and looks like we don't have our Norman sounding in quite yet, but this is our Fort Worth sounding, and we can take some things from this. You see it right away. Moisture extending up into the atmosphere, decent moist layer there, up to about 850 millibars beneath a very stout capping inversion. Very strong elevated mix layer has made its way out across the central to southern plains by this morning. And of course that EML, we always talk about it, that's that layer of well-mixed dry warm air that originates at the higher terrain surfaces of the desert southwest, western Mexico, and translates northeastward atop this moist layer at the surface across the plains, and that allows for instability to build throughout the day and keep storm coverage at bay until it finally erodes. Well, this is going to be the question mark today, is this capping inversion. This is a very stout elevated mix layer, very stout capping inversion. In fact, if we look at our convective inhibition, approaching 400 joules per kilogram, minus 400 joules per kilogram, that is an extremely strong warm nose there. And we're not going to have extremely robust forcing in the southern portion of the target, Oklahoma down into Texas along the dry line, to erode this cap. We are expecting to get fairly close, though. There should be strong convergence along the dry line. We'll show you that with the models here in just a second. There should be strong surface heating throughout the day. If we look at our visible satellite imagery, you do see quite a bit of sunshine across the regions. There's some high clouds here east of that dry line. Those should we should get rid of those throughout the day. We should have some nice heating going on into the afternoon hours today. So we're going to have to monitor that for sure. And because this is a very strong cap, and southern portions may have a little bit tougher time eroding that cap. Farther north, the cap is maybe a little bit weaker. Let's see if we have a sounding here. So let's go to our station map. Let's go to Omaha. This may be a little bit too far north right now. Not quite. Looks like we have some semblance of moisture there going up into the atmosphere. Definitely some semblance of cap here to the north, but this is still quite capped. 200 about minus 250 joules per kilogram of convective inhibition there. So we do have a stout cap to the north. Maybe it's a little bit weaker than farther south. We also will have a little bit better forcing up here as we have a well-timed shortwave that's going to move through into the afternoon hours. So interesting look at this point. We should have this is maybe just north of the frontal zone at this point, so not 100% representative of the overall warm sector, but it does give us a decent picture. We do have some elevated instability in place at this point. We'll go back down to Fort Worth. We do have some elevated instability at this point. That should continue to build throughout the day as this cap remains strong, keeps the warm sector free and clear of convection. We should see that instability really blossom today, expecting it to get up into the 2,500, maybe even 3,000 to 3,500 joules per kilogram range, especially with southern extent along the dry line. So it's a somewhat conditional setup, but we are seeing some signs that storms may form, and we'll show you that by looking at the NAM data here. And again, we have seen a lot of variance among the models about this surface pattern. The NAM has definitely been the most robust with the surface pattern, and we'll show you that here in just a second. This is the 6Z NAM. The 12Z NAM is not quite in yet. Before we do that, I want to take a look at the new outlook, see if that is out yet. And they have added an enhanced risk now. Enhanced risk up in the northeast Kansas, southeast Nebraska, southwest Iowa vicinity there. So level 3 out of 5 there. We do have an additional slight risk area that's now extended into northwest Texas, and a 5% has been added down here along the dry line here, just west of the Oklahoma City Metro, down toward Lawton and Fort Sill, in toward the Wichita Falls area. So dual 5% areas up in here in the enhanced risk area, and then farther south along the dry line. Damaging winds and large hail still a threat. They have now enhanced or upgraded the threat to a 30% hatched significant hail threat up there northeast of the triple point there in the enhanced risk area. So interesting update there from this latest outlook. And so let's go ahead and look at some model data. So this is our 500 millibar pattern on the 6Z NAM. 12Z NAM's not quite in yet. So you see we get just ever so slight amplification of this trough as it starts to eject into the plains this afternoon into the evening. And we just have broad southwesterly flow east of that trough axis. If we go down to 700 millibars, you'll see what looks to be somewhat of a shortwave here. So we go through the day, and you see this little bit of shortwave start to develop here. This could be some semblance of that dry line circulation extending up very high into the atmosphere. We see a little bit of troughiness there where the dry line should be. But we do have some enhanced flow here just east of the dry line. That could help things go a little bit. But it's going to be a very subtle wave. It actually looks like it does originate back in here. Little kink in the height contours there, moving out to the east with time, and therefore interacts with the dry line and warm sector. This is about 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, so this could be a little bit of assistance here for a little bit of enhanced assistance here for storm development there, especially with northern extent into Kansas. Again, a little bit more nebulous down here to the south along the dry line. Let's go down to 850 millibars here. And you see we have a strong low-level jet in place. I can hear the wind ripping outside this morning. Very strong low-level jet, 40, 50 knots or so out there across Kansas into Oklahoma in areas to the north. That will continue to move off to the northeast today. We should see a little bit, they should see it wane during the day. But as we get that cyclogenesis out there to the west, you see that cyclone center here setting up there across eastern Colorado. That should help strengthen those low-level winds. You see as we go towards sunset, that low-level jet really ramps up there, 40 knots to even 50 knots there. And then even more as we go just after sunset, especially up there into Kansas and Missouri. Up there in the northern portion of the target, any supercells ongoing here could also tap into that strong low-level jet there down into Oklahoma. Down at the surface, we should see a similar response, given that that trough moving in and traversing the Rockies. So you see that initial surface low up here along the Kansas-Nebraska border. That will meander off to the northeast, and then we will get continued cyclogenesis there in southeast Colorado this afternoon. This is at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. At that point, so late morning into early afternoon, we should really start to see that dry line sharpen up here from Kansas down into Oklahoma and North Texas. We'll show you the moisture here in just a second. Go forward, that surface low deepens pretty nicely, and that is just a classic surface pattern for central to southern plains severe weather. Strong deepening surface low out there in southwest Kansas, strong dry line out ahead of it. That is a classic feature. Again, capping makes things a little bit more difficult to figure out today, but given that we have such strong features here, that cold front sagging down from the south ahead of this surface low, which gives a little extra oomph. Definitely this northern target looks a little bit less conditional than areas farther to the south along the dry line, but we'll talk about that in just a second, that dry line target. So let's go to the moisture, and I'm going to zoom in on our floater sector here. So you see we already have 60s dew points stretching up, and this is, we'll go ahead and go northward, forward in time a little bit, 60s dew points up in here into southeast Nebraska by this point. Looks like it's a little bit off. Current surface indications, current surface data not showing those 60s dew points up here in Nebraska quite as robust as what the NAM was showing. So the NAM is possibly a little bit too aggressive with moisture return here. But the overall pattern and what's going to happen throughout the afternoon is fairly a good representation here on the NAM. So we go into the late morning and afternoon, and we really start to see that dry line sharpen as we go into the afternoon. This is 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Sharp dry line here extending all the way into Texas, up into Oklahoma and Kansas. That cold front up here into Iowa and southeast Nebraska. So that, again, that surface low back out here to the west, deepening as we go through the afternoon. This is at 0Z, and so this is a very interesting pattern. Our surface low is back out in here, the center of the surface low, back there near Garden City, Kansas or so, at least on the NAM. And we really have this dry line start to arc back into that extended, stretched out surface low there. And you see a little bit of this bulge right here, a little bit of a dry line bulge. And then you have your cold front up in here sagging to the south across the region. And this creates what we call a triple point right here, where those two boundaries somewhat intersect. It's a little nebulous here on the NAM, but where these two boundaries intersect, that's what we call a triple point. A triple point is just the intersection point between two different boundaries. And that looks to set up here, at least on the NAM, somewhere in central to north central Kansas. So you want to be right out ahead of that to allow, and that, of course, as we know, two boundaries intersecting, that means extra forcing for storms. That's why the up northern target's a little less conditional, I think. You have a little bit better forcing at the intersection point of those two boundaries. So we should see storm development somewhere up here along that frontal boundary and just ahead of the triple point up into north central to northeast Kansas by this afternoon. We go to 3Z here. That dry line stays put. You see that cold front continues to sag southward. Dry line there, so triple point stays put there. And again, that should fire some storms out in this vicinity here. Now maybe a little bit too far west. Let's look at the wrap. So the wrap has it maybe a little bit farther to the east here. A little bit worse with the moisture quality. The NAM may be a little bit too robust with that moisture quality, as we said. But I think low 60s dew points are a good bet up here into Nebraska and Kansas. So interesting setup here for sure. The extra forcing along that triple point. That's why they have the enhanced risk up here near that cold front. Let's see what they say real quick just about that enhanced risk. Low level moisture established in the warm sector. Central Plains cyclone. Prominent zone for severe storm development this evening and tonight will be from northeast Kansas into southeast Nebraska and vicinity. Warm elevated mixed layer and associated cap will inhibit warm sector thunderstorm development through much of the afternoon. So that's what we were talking about, those soundings. Definitely showing a robust capping inversion out across the warm sector today, which will inhibit storm development for much of the day. Now, along the triple point, low-level convergence and surface heating will be maximized to the northeast of the cold front dry line triple point along the northwest edge of the primary moisture and buoyancy axis. Storms that form in this area this evening will likely become supercells given ML Cape in excess of 2,500 joules per kilogram. So strong instability there. The initial threat will be very large hail, potentially 3 inches in diameter or larger, as well as damaging gusts, increasing low-level shear and hodograph curvature during the evening, and 60 dew points surging into the frontal zone suggests some potential for a couple tornadoes. The storm mode will trend more linear overnight as convection develops. So very interesting there that they are showing. Definitely this area is a little bit less conditional, hence the upgrade in probabilities. Let's take a sounding here from this northern mode. We'll go here at 0Z. Let's take one right here at about Manhattan, Kansas, just ahead of that triple point south of the frontal zone. And we've been seeing all week long some pretty favorable profiles here for severe weather. This is at 0Z, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. You see the NAM has a little bit of capping remaining. And again, this is the NAM, so we have to keep that in mind that the surface temperatures may be a little bit too cool based on what we should actually see. The forecast temperatures have been in the 80s across this region. Given that the temperatures are already up there into the upper 60s here, you see 67, 68 across this region, I definitely think we will surpass what the NAM is showing here, perhaps temperatures up into the low 80s, which will make temperature dew point spreads a little bit higher, low 60s dew points, low 80s temperatures, really on the verge, on the margins for tornadic supercells, but still within the realm of possibility. So again, not too concerned about this capping inversion given the increased convergence along the triple point. That air is forced to rise along that triple point a little bit better, and a little bit better forcing from the trough up here to the north across this region. I do think storms will fire ahead of that triple point and eventually congeal into a line as that cold front moves southeastward going into the evening hours. You see eventually it does congeal into a line, and up here more so on the cold front as those storms move northward, those upper level winds are fairly parallel to that boundary. We'll take a look at our shear vectors with respect to the boundary. So here's our cold front, here's the dry line. You see those shear vectors are pretty parallel to the boundary. So I think we will have a discrete mode initially, given some eroding capping with time, and overall subtle forcing, but I think eventually we will see these storms congeal into a line as these upper level flow and bulk shear is definitely more parallel to the initiating boundary. Down here along the dry line though, just as an aside, you see here that the shear vectors are very much off the dry line, which will help sustain discrete storm development with any storms that do fire along the dry line. So you do see a very, very favorable profile, 3,300 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Again, we'll ignore that capping inversion for now, but very unstable environment. Initially weak low-level shear. Let me go back a little bit here and show you initially weak low-level shear should foster that large hail threat amid very strong instability. So we'll take a sounding. This is from 4 p.m. You see very strong instability in place already, 3,600 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. But notice your low-level shear is very weak. So we will sustain supercells in this environment, about 35 knots or so of bulk shear, but low-level shear is very weak. This is a classic, very large hail sounding. Hate to say the G word, the giant hail, but that is definitely a possibility today given very strong instability, 3,000 joules per kilogram, and very weak low-level shear at least to start. And then by evening, we will see that increase in low-level shear, very favorable looking photographs for a few tornadoes up there. Strong veering of those low-level winds with height, assuming we can get surface-based convection. Again, we'll have to watch this little capping inversion here to make sure it does erode. I do think with northern extent, it will erode fairly easily. Given strong surface heating, convergence along that triple point, and a little bit of help from the trough. Now, farther south along the dry line, a little bit more conditional. We do see that dry line extend back into North Texas, down into Oklahoma as well. And so this is a little bit more conditional. Again, we're a little bit farther removed from the overall forcing, but we do see a very strong convergence along that dry line. Those winds coming together out of the southwest, and then southerly winds here. So there should be strong convergence along the dry line and strong surface heating throughout the day, given some ample sunshine throughout the day. This will allow that cap to somewhat erode. We will have a little bit of help, I think, from the trough, a little bit of stronger winds aloft, maybe that shortwave moving in just far enough south to keep that area in play. And so let's take a sounding here. This is at 0Z. We'll take one down here at Lawton, just ahead of the dry line. And so this is going to be this environment down here. You do see that the NAM does pretty well erode that cap. The surface temperatures are definitely warmer down here. I do expect maybe a little bit higher moisture than areas farther north, given we're closer to the moisture source, of course, and a little bit higher temperatures here, perhaps. Temperatures into the low to mid 80s, perhaps. I think that should be enough to erode the cap. If we look at our convective temperature, that's the temperature we were to exclude all forcing mechanisms that we would have to heat the surface to in order to get storms to fire, just air mass thunderstorms to fire. Our convective temperature is 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Our high on the NAM here is 80, and I think that could be a little bit higher, closer to 84, 85 perhaps, maybe 80, 83, 84, 85. If that's the case, we're going to get close, plus we have the convergence from the dry line, a little bit of exterior help from the trough and the dry line. That should be enough to initiate storms. And given that the flow along the dry line here is out of the southwest in the low to mid levels, 850 and 750 millibar flow is definitely out of the southwest here. The dry line is oriented somewhat that direction, so that could allow storms to stay in that dry line, updrafts to stay in that dry line circulation, that zone of ascent along the dry line a little bit longer, and therefore we may have a little bit better chance of sustaining convective development here to the southwest, across southwest Oklahoma into northwest Texas. So I do think it is very, very plausible we see a storm or two along the dry line here, southwest Oklahoma to northwest Texas, moving northeast, in the general direction of the OKC metro area. Will they make it there? Tough to say, as we will start to get that cap to build back in as we go towards sunset. And just after, you'll see temperatures drop, that boundary layer gets separated. Well, this is really interesting. The 6Z NAM at 3Z has it purely destabilized here. That is really interesting to note. And that could be very interesting as we see this wind profile is quite favorable for supercells of all hazards here as we go into the early evening hours. Very strong low-level shear and strong instability as well. So that is interesting to note here. Let's take a 3Z sounding up in here, maybe at the Kansas-Nebraska border. Wow, that is interesting. I didn't expect that. Perhaps continued strong low-level warm moist advection along, thanks to that surface low. Here up to the north, you do see that capping staying in place there. So that's an interesting development. I did not expect to see that. I expected to see that cap build back in as surface temperatures cool a little bit, but we do have that strong surface low that will continue to deepen and move off to the northeast. That may help a little bit as far as allowing storms to continue a little bit longer into the early evening. That sounding may have been a little bit contaminated. Let's try to find one here. That is pretty interesting, I have to say. So we'll have to watch that for sure. The SPC not really thinking that the southern mode will have a very lengthy amount of time for a sustained supercells there in the southern mode. We'll read the description here. Storm initiation will rely on the depth of mixing with surface heating along the dryline and on parcel residence time in the dryline zone of ascent. Flow in the 850 millibar to 700 millibar layer will be a bit more parallel to the dryline compared to yesterday, which may allow long enough residence times to reach an LFC, level of free convection. That's exactly what we were talking about. the dry line, the orientation of the mid-level winds and the dry line are pretty similar, which may allow updrafts to stay in that zone of ascent along the dry line a little bit longer, and therefore it could be slightly more favorable for storms to sustain themselves along the dry line there in southwest Oklahoma to northwest Texas. So very interesting there that they are on the same page as we are. If storms form, the environment favors a conditional threat of isolated very large hail, initially fairly weak low-level shear. Let me take a sounding here out in southwest Oklahoma. Should be the same as what we saw up to the north, and so yeah, you see strong instability, weak deep layer shear to start, favors very large hail with any supercells that can sustain early on, and then low-level shear will ramp up as the low-level jet increases, so we'll see a tornado threat increase with time there in both of these modes. Storms should stay fairly discreet down here for longer than the northern mode. We said that cold front would start to inch southeastward a little bit, and that flow aloft parallel to that cold front. So once the storms move off that triple point, they should have a little bit more of a tendency to become clustered and more messy. Down here, that's not going to be the case. Given a little bit of remnant capping, perhaps, that should keep storm development very isolated, as well as shear vectors oriented very perpendicular to the initiating boundary. So discrete supercells are definitely a possibility down here in southwest Oklahoma to northwest Texas. Let's look at a couple of the models here, the convective allowing models. We'll see the 12Z HRRR, not quite out far enough yet. We'll look at the 11Z HRRR, and the HRRR has really done a poor job of depicting the overall pattern here. So I want you to look at the surface pattern here, the surface low and dew points. So you see that dry line really is not super tight. That surface low is a little bit placed differently than the NAM. It has been mixing the dry line fairly far east. The NAM kind of curves it back in here a little bit stronger surface low. So we'll have to watch that for sure. I think the NAM or the HRRR is over mixing a little bit, mixing the dry line east just a tad. Does maintain fairly nice 60s dew points east of the dry line there, but I don't love the surface pattern here. Not sure I buy that surface pattern here with the HRRR. So let's go ahead and look ahead. This is what the HRRR shows. You see much of the day all clear across the areas as that cap holds strong. Then we finally get some ascent. It looks like it does want to pinpoint eastern Iowa as a potential target along the warm frontal zone. That is a possibility. We could see a few storms up there along the warm front into Iowa, but the forcing's a little bit more nebulous there, so it may be tough to get. I'm not sure. I'm a little skeptical about this environment, but we could see a few supercells up there along the warm front before things get a little bit more messy as that cold front sags southeastward with time. You see storms finally do develop there about 1Z. Always like to subtract a couple hours from the HRRR, as the timing is always a little bit late, it seems. So this would be about 22, 23Z, 5, 6 p.m. or so for initiation up there, just south of the Kansas-Nebraska border and into southeast Nebraska, with some stronger storms up in there before things really start to cluster and line out. Nothing down here in the southern mode, even here. I guess your triple point would be more up here along the HRRR, a little bit farther southwest on the NAM. So it just depends where that sets up. It's going to be critical to watch the observations today instead of paying attention to the models. Nothing down here in Oklahoma. I think that's just the HRRR being a little bit stingy, as it typically is in these somewhat capped environments. We don't have the 12Z WRF models in, but the solutions from last night from the WRF models were pretty interesting. This is the 0Z ARW. So it shows storm development up in here, out about 0Z, so maybe a little bit earlier, 5, 6 p.m. there across northeast Kansas, southeast Nebraska. We do see a few storms down here along the dry line, though, as well, North Texas into central Oklahoma. This would be right near the Oklahoma City metro area. And again, don't worry too much about placement right now, but notice that it is firing a few supercells down here along the dry line, and it does allow them to last for a couple hours. So we could have an all-hazards threat with those if that solution does come to fruition. NSSL WRF from last night as well. Much of the same thing, I believe. Storm initiation there in northern Kansas by late afternoon, and some attempts here along the dry line, although not that robust. Will be interesting to see what the cams show this morning when they come out, but again, not going to be really relying on the observations this morning to pick a target for today and see how things are going to play out. So that's going to do it for today's setup. Again, we have this now enhanced risk area here from northeast Kansas into southeast Nebraska, northwest Missouri, southwest Iowa. Tornado threat is going to be there, as well as damaging winds and perhaps a large to significant hail threat there. We also have a threat along the dry line down there in southwest Oklahoma, 5% there in the slight risk area. southwest Oklahoma, west of the OKC metro area, Fort Sill, Lawton, down toward Wichita Falls, Texas. Damaging winds and large hail are going to be a threat as well down there along the dry line. A little bit more conditional down there, but we are seeing some evidence of storm initiation there along the dry line. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Quick note on tomorrow into Friday. The cold front will continue to sag south. Once again, we have that slight risk there for tomorrow with all hazards on the table, and then for Friday as well. Backing out to the 500 millibar pattern, you see that trough does start to swing through here, but that cold front is going to be the main player tomorrow. We should have some forcing aloft. Synoptic scale forcing, but you see this frontal zone as the surface low really quickly moves off to the northeast. That frontal zone will sag southeastward, eventually into the nighttime hours, and then move off to the east. So you see that frontal zone will be that main initiating factor for storms tomorrow. Rich moisture here down into Texas and Arkansas ahead of the cold front. And we should see, again, a more messy mode, given that the upper level, the shear vectors are very much parallel to that initiating boundary. Here is our cold front there. Shear vectors much like that, so very much parallel to the initiating boundary. That should create a more messy mode. Here's a sample profile from the warm sector there south of the cold front. Decent instability there, 2,200 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Fully destabilized, deep moisture, that is a good thing. We do have a little bit of curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, but any discrete cells may be more apt to produce some large hail initially, maybe a tornado or two before the damaging wind threat takes over as storms congeal along that southward moving cold front. So if we look at, actually, let's just cap it off there. I think that's a good place to stop for today. So tomorrow, anywhere from southeast Missouri into Arkansas and northeast Texas has a severe threat with all hazards on the table. And then going into Friday, that threat will shift southward toward the Texas coast. But today's threat, very, very interesting setup. Will be very interesting to see how this plays out. Once again, enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 up here to the north. Perhaps a dryline target to the south with all hazards at play in both, given fairly favorable profiles, very strong instability. Weak low-level shear to start will favor a very large to giant hail threat. Initially, 3+ inches possible, 3+ inch hailstones possible, and then we will see a tornado threat ramp up as we go toward the evening. Again, a little bit more conditional down here to the south, but we are seeing some evidence that storms may sustain down here to the south along the dry line. A little bit less conditional up here to the north near that triple point where the forcing is going to be strongest. I think we see a few storms there ahead of that triple point. They will have an all hazards threat as well before they congeal more into a line or messier mode this evening. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.